"You clearly don't belong in my courtroom. Now get on your knees and clean up this mess you made." Judge Eleanor Whitfield's shrill voice echoed through the marble-walled courtroom as natural daylight poured through the high windows. The black woman in the red dress suit and navy skirt had accidentally dropped her briefcase, sending papers flying across the polished floor. As DeShawn Carter bent down to collect the documents, Whitfield stepped closer, her heel grinding against DeShawn Carter's hand. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before stepping foot in a real court," Whitfield hissed, while a room full of lawyers, bailiffs, and spectators watched in uncomfortable silence under the harsh fluorescent lighting. The judge's white face twisted with satisfaction as she watched the woman crawl across the floor. But Whitfield's triumphant expression froze when her bailiff whispered urgently in her ear, his face pale with terror. The woman she'd just humiliated wasn't just any lawyer. She was Attorney General DeShawn Carter, and those men in suits entering the courtroom weren't spectators. Welcome to Chains Broken. Here, we tell the stories of those who stood tall when the world told them to kneel. If their bravery inspires you, hit subscribe and help us ensure these heroes are never forgotten. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in Judge Eleanor Whitfield's courtroom. The overhead fluorescent lights cast their harsh glow across the mahogany benches and marble floors, while natural sunlight streamed through the tall windows, creating a stark contrast that seemed to highlight every detail of what was about to unfold. Defense attorney Tiffany Okafor sat in the second row, her orange blouse and black slacks pristine as she reviewed her case files. She had heard whispers about Judge Whitfield's courtroom, about the way things went differently for black defendants, but she had never witnessed it firsthand. Bailiff Eugene Garrett stood at his usual position near the judge's bench, his uniform pressed and his expression neutral. He had worked in this courthouse for 15 years, and in that time, he had seen Judge Whitfield's behavior evolve from subtle bias to something much darker. Today, something felt different in the air, a tension that made the back of his neck prickle with unease. Court reporter Vivian Stanton positioned herself at her stenography machine, her fingers ready to capture every word. What she didn't reveal to anyone was the small recording device hidden in her purse, a tool she had been using for months to document the disturbing patterns she witnessed daily. Her brown hair was pulled back in a tight bun, her professional demeanor masking the growing horror she felt at what she had been forced to witness and record. At exactly 9:30, Judge Eleanor Whitfield swept into the courtroom, her black robes billowing behind her like a dark cloud. Her silver hair was pulled back severely, emphasizing the sharp angles of her pale face and the cold calculation in her blue eyes. She had held this position for 12 years, and in that time, she had built what she considered an empire of order and control. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Eleanor Whitfield," Bailiff Garrett announced, his voice carrying across the courtroom as everyone stood in unison. DeShawn Carter rose with the rest of the courtroom, her red blazer and navy skirt perfectly tailored, her briefcase held firmly in her right hand. To everyone present, she appeared to be just another defense attorney, perhaps newer to this particular courtroom, given the way she studied the proceedings with such intense focus. Her dark skin seemed to glow under the fluorescent lighting, and her natural hair was styled in a professional twist that spoke of confidence and competence. "Be seated," Judge Whitfield commanded, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom like a predator surveying her territory. Her eyes lingered momentarily on DeShawn Carter, a flicker of disdain crossing her features before she settled into her high-backed chair. The morning proceeded with typical courtroom business. Prosecutor Winston Sato, a thin man in his 40s, wearing a gray suit and blue tie, presented his cases with practiced efficiency. Tiffany Okafor noticed how different his tone became when presenting cases involving black defendants versus white ones, how his recommendations for sentencing seemed to follow an invisible but unmistakable pattern. It was during the third case of the morning that everything changed. DeShawn Carter had been taking detailed notes, her pen moving steadily across her legal pad as she observed the proceedings. When she rose to adjust her position, her briefcase slipped from her grasp, hitting the floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent courtroom. Papers exploded across the polished marble floor like white birds seeking escape. Legal documents, case files, and handwritten notes scattered in every direction, some sliding under benches, others coming to rest near the judge's elevated platform. The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Whitfield's face transformed, her professional mask slipping to reveal something ugly and raw underneath. Her lips curled into a sneer as she stood, her hands gripping the edge of her bench until her knuckles turned white. "How dare you disrupt my courtroom with your clumsiness?" Whitfield's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "You people always make such messes wherever you go." The words hung in the air like poison. Tiffany Okafor's pen stopped moving. Court reporter Vivian Stanton's fingers hesitated over her keys. Bailiff Eugene Garrett shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening as he recognized the dangerous territory they were entering. DeShawn Carter remained calm, her voice steady as she responded, "I apologize, Your Honor. I'll clean this up immediately." "Oh, you'll do more than that," Whitfield said, stepping down from her bench with predatory grace. Her heels clicked against the marble as she approached the scattered papers. "You clearly don't belong in my courtroom. Now get on your knees and clean up this mess you made, like the servant you are." The words hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Several spectators gasped audibly. Tiffany Okafor's hand moved instinctively to her phone, her finger hovering over the record button as her heart pounded against her ribs. DeShawn Carter looked up at the judge, her dark eyes revealing nothing of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Without a word, she lowered herself to her knees, her red blazer bright against the white marble as she began gathering the scattered documents. But Whitfield wasn't finished. "That's right, stay down where you belong," the judge hissed, moving closer until she stood directly over DeShawn Carter. "Maybe next time, you'll think twice before stepping foot in a real court with real lawyers." As DeShawn Carter reached for a document near Whitfield's feet, the judge deliberately stepped forward, the pointed heel of her black pump grinding down onto DeShawn Carter's outstretched hand. The pressure was excruciating, but DeShawn Carter didn't flinch. She didn't cry out. She simply continued gathering papers with her free hand, while Whitfield's heel pressed deeper into her skin. "You people always think you can waltz in here and demand respect," Whitfield continued, her voice growing more vicious with each word. "But I know what you really are. I know where you belong." Tiffany Okafor couldn't take it anymore. Her thumb found the record button on her phone as she held it low, capturing every horrifying moment. Tears of rage and shame filled her eyes as she watched a fellow black professional being degraded in the most public and humiliating way possible. Bailiff Eugene Garrett took a step forward, his conscience warring with his self-preservation. He had seen Judge Whitfield's bias before, but this was different. This was criminal. This was something that would haunt him for the rest of his life if he didn't act. "Your Honor," he began hesitantly. "Perhaps we should—" "Silence!" Whitfield snapped without turning around, her heel grinding harder into DeShawn Carter's hand. "Unless you want to join her down there, you'll keep your mouth shut." Court reporter Vivian Stanton's hidden recorder captured every word, every inflection, every sound of heel against skin and paper against marble. Her professional training kept her face neutral, but inside, she was documenting what she knew would be a historic moment. DeShawn Carter continued collecting papers, her movements methodical and dignified despite the degradation being heaped upon her. Each document she gathered was evidence of the corruption she had come to expose, and each racist slur from Whitfield's mouth was another nail in the judge's coffin. "Look at you crawling around like an animal," Whitfield taunted, finally lifting her heel, only to place her foot inches from DeShawn Carter's face. "This is where you belong. This is what you are." The courtroom had become a powder keg of tension. Spectators sat frozen in their seats, witnessing something that would be burned into their memories forever. Some pulled out phones, others simply stared in shock, but everyone understood they were watching something that would change everything. As DeShawn Carter gathered the final papers, organizing them carefully despite her injured hand, she remained silent. Her composure was absolute, her dignity intact, despite every attempt to strip it away. She had endured worse than this in her decades of fighting for justice, and she knew that every second of humiliation she absorbed now would be repaid with compound interest when the truth was revealed. Judge Whitfield stepped back, her face flushed with sick satisfaction. Now get up and get out of my courtroom. And don't come back unless you learn some proper respect for your betters." But as DeShawn Carter rose to her feet, brushing imaginary dust from her red blazer, Bailiff Eugene Garrett noticed something that made his blood run cold. 3 men in dark suits had entered the back of the courtroom during Whitfield's tirade. They weren't lawyers, they weren't court staff, they were something else entirely, and the way they positioned themselves near the exits suggested they weren't planning to leave anytime soon. Eugene Garrett's face went pale as recognition dawned. He had seen men like this before, years ago when federal investigators had swept through the courthouse in a corruption case that had ended several careers. His hands trembled as he approached Judge Whitfield's bench. "Your Honor," he whispered urgently, his voice barely audible, "we have a problem." But Judge Whitfield was drunk on her own power, her eyes still fixed on DeShawn Carter with triumphant malice. She waved Eugene away, dismissively, completely unaware that her world was about to collapse around her. The fluorescent lights continued to hum overhead, casting their harsh illumination on a scene that would be replayed in news broadcasts around the world. The natural daylight streaming through the windows seemed to spotlight the moment when justice finally prepared to reveal itself. DeShawn Carter stood tall, her injured hand still clutching the papers, her eyes meeting Judge Whitfield's gaze with an intensity that should have warned the corrupt judge that something was very, very wrong. But Eleanor Whitfield was too intoxicated by her perceived victory to notice the steel beneath DeShawn Carter's calm exterior, too blinded by her own racism to see that she had just sealed her own fate in the most public way possible. The men in suits took another step forward, their badges hidden, but their authority unmistakable. In moments, everything would change. But for now, the tension built like a storm about to break, and Judge Eleanor Whitfield remained blissfully unaware that she had just humiliated the one person who had the power to destroy her completely. 3 weeks before the humiliation in Judge Eleanor Whitfield's courtroom, the federal building buzzed with urgent activity under the bright fluorescent lights of Conference Room 7. Agent Randall Cooper, a tall, muscular man in a crisp navy blue suit and white dress shirt, stood before a wall-mounted display screen showing surveillance photos and case files. His team of federal investigators sat around the polished conference table, their faces illuminated by the overhead lighting streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're about to see represents 18 months of intensive investigation into one of the most corrupt judicial operations we've encountered," Cooper announced, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated evidence. He clicked his remote, and the screen filled with a photograph of Judge Eleanor Whitfield in her black robes, her cold blue eyes staring directly at the camera. Detective Heather Lamb, an athletic black woman wearing a green blazer and black slacks, leaned forward in her chair. Her undercover work at the courthouse had given her first-hand knowledge of Whitfield's operation. "Agent Cooper, the pattern we've documented goes beyond typical corruption. This is systematic racial targeting, disguised as legitimate judicial proceedings." The screen shifted to show statistical charts comparing sentencing data. Cooper pointed to the glaring disparities with his laser pointer. Black defendants appearing before Judge Whitfield received sentences averaging 67% longer than white defendants for identical crimes. The statistical probability of this occurring naturally is less than 1 in 10 million. Attorney General DeShawn Carter sat at the head of the table, her red blazer and black pencil skirt impeccable despite the late hour. Her brown eyes studied each piece of evidence with laser focus, occasionally making notes on her legal pad. The weight of what they were uncovering settled heavily on her shoulders, but her determination never wavered. "Show me the bribery evidence," DeShawn Carter requested, her voice steady, but containing an undertone of controlled anger. Cooper clicked to surveillance footage showing Judge Whitfield's chambers after hours. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m. as they watched a well-dressed white man hand Whitfield an envelope thick with cash. "This is real estate developer Marcus Pennington. His son was arrested for vehicular manslaughter while driving under the influence. 3 days after this payment, the charges were reduced to reckless driving with a suspended sentence." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Agent Sarah Mitchell, a forensic accountant in a gray pantsuit, consulted her files. We've traced over $200,000 in unexplained deposits to Whitfield's offshore accounts over the past 2 years. Each deposit correlates with a favorable ruling for wealthy white defendants. DeShawn Carter's jaw tightened as she processed the scope of the corruption. This wasn't just about individual cases. It was about the systematic perversion of justice itself. What about Prosecutor Winston Sato's involvement? Detective Lamb pulled out her tablet, scrolling through documented incidents. Sato has been deliberately sabotaging cases involving black defendants. He withholds exculpatory evidence, fails to interview key witnesses, and makes inadequate plea bargain offers designed to force defendants into accepting longer sentences. The screen displayed email exchanges between Whitfield and Sato, their communications coded but clearly coordinating their corrupt activities. Cooper highlighted key phrases that revealed their conspiracy. Notice how they refer to cleaning up the docket and maintaining community standards. These are euphemisms for their racial targeting operation. DeShawn Carter stood up, pacing to the window where natural skylight mixed with the fluorescent illumination. The city stretched out below, thousands of families affected by the corruption they were investigating. How many victims are we talking about? Agent Mitchell consulted her comprehensive database. Our preliminary count shows over 400 black men and women who received excessive sentences in Whitfield's courtroom. Many are currently serving time they shouldn't be serving. Some have lost jobs, homes, and families due to these unjust convictions. The human cost of the corruption hit everyone in the room like a physical blow. These weren't just statistics. They were real people whose lives had been destroyed by systematic racism masquerading as judicial authority. Cooper advanced to the next presentation slide, showing court reporter Vivian Stanton. The elderly black woman appeared professional in her navy blue dress and pearls, but her eyes held the weight of terrible secrets. Miss Stanton has been documenting everything. She's recorded hundreds of hours of Whitfield making racist comments in chambers, discussing bribes, and coordinating with Sato to target black defendants. DeShawn Carter returned to her seat, her mind already formulating strategy. The evidence was overwhelming, but they needed something more to ensure conviction and complete exposure of the conspiracy. What kind of access can we get to gather additional evidence? Detective Lamb leaned forward, her expression serious. I've been working undercover as courthouse security for 6 months. Whitfield trusts me enough to speak freely around me, but we need someone on the inside who can get closer to her operations. Cooper nodded, understanding where the conversation was heading. We need an undercover attorney who can appear before Whitfield's court regularly, someone who can witness and document her bias firsthand while gathering intelligence on her network. The room fell silent as everyone realized what this meant. Going undercover in Whitfield's courtroom would mean subjecting themselves to her racist abuse and systematic humiliation. It was dangerous on multiple levels, both professionally and personally. DeShawn Carter set down her pen and looked around the table at her team. Her voice was firm with resolve. I'll do it. Agent Cooper's eyes widened in surprise. Attorney General, with respect, the personal risk is enormous. If Whitfield discovers your true identity before we're ready to move, she could destroy evidence and flee. Plus, the undercover work will require you to endure significant abuse. DeShawn Carter's expression never wavered. She had reviewed every case file, seen every victim's story, and understood the scope of the systematic oppression. Agent Cooper, I've spent my entire career fighting for justice. I won't ask someone else to take risks I'm not willing to take myself. Detective Lamb nodded with understanding. Attorney General, I've watched Whitfield operate for months. Her racism isn't just professional, it's personal and vicious. She takes pleasure in humiliating black attorneys and defendants. Then we need to use that against her, DeShawn Carter replied, her strategic mind already working through the possibilities. Her racism makes her predictable. We can anticipate her actions and use them to gather the evidence we need. Cooper pulled up building schematics and surveillance plans. We'll need to establish your cover identity carefully. You'll need a complete background as a defense attorney with a small practice. Detective Lamb will monitor from inside the courthouse while we maintain external surveillance. Agent Mitchell opened her laptop, already beginning the identity creation process. We'll need references, bar association records, even client testimonials. The cover has to be perfect, because Whitfield will certainly investigate any new attorney appearing in her courtroom. DeShawn Carter studied the courthouse floor plans, mentally preparing for what lay ahead. What about court reporter Stanton? Can we coordinate with her directly? Cooper shook his head cautiously. We can't risk exposing her. She's our most valuable asset because Whitfield completely trusts her. Any direct contact could compromise years of evidence gathering. The meeting continued for another 2 hours as they refined every detail of the undercover operation. DeShawn Carter would take on several legitimate cases, representing actual clients while gathering evidence. The personal stakes couldn't be higher. Discovery would mean the end of her career and potentially her safety. Detective Lamb provided detailed intelligence about Whitfield's daily routines and psychological patterns. She's most aggressive in morning sessions when she's fresh and wants to establish dominance. Afternoon sessions tend to be rushed, but she's more likely to make verbal mistakes. Agent Cooper assigned surveillance teams and communication protocols. We'll have agents positioned throughout the courthouse and surrounding area. Detective Lamb will be your primary contact inside, but communication must be minimal and coded. As the briefing concluded, DeShawn Carter felt the full weight of what she was undertaking. She would be walking into the lion's den, subjecting herself to racist abuse while maintaining perfect composure. The slightest mistake could unravel months of investigation and allow systematic corruption to continue destroying lives. Cooper gathered his files, looking directly at DeShawn Carter. Attorney General, once this operation begins, there's no turning back. Whitfield will test you in ways we can't fully anticipate. DeShawn Carter stood up, her red blazer catching the conference room lights as she straightened her shoulders. Agent Cooper, 400 families are counting on us to expose this corruption. Whatever personal cost I have to pay is insignificant compared to the justice we'll deliver. The team dispersed to begin their preparations, each understanding their crucial role in the operation. Detective Lamb would maintain her undercover position while monitoring DeShawn Carter's safety. Agent Cooper would coordinate external surveillance and evidence collection. The forensic team would continue analyzing financial records and communication intercepts. Over the following weeks, DeShawn Carter's cover identity took shape. She became a defense attorney struggling to build her practice, taking court appointments and minor cases. Her office was set up in a modest building across town, complete with case files and client meetings that supported her cover story. The personal preparation was equally intensive. DeShawn Carter studied Whitfield's previous interactions with black attorneys, mentally preparing herself for the racism and humiliation she would face. She practiced maintaining composure while being verbally abused, knowing that her reaction could make or break the entire operation. As the day approached for her first appearance in Whitfield's courtroom, DeShawn Carter understood that she was about to undertake the most dangerous and personally challenging mission of her career. But the faces of those 400 victims remained fixed in her mind, driving her forward with unshakable determination. The investigation had revealed the full scope of Whitfield's corruption. Now it was time to gather the final evidence needed to bring down the entire conspiracy and restore justice to a system that had been perverted by racism and greed. The fluorescent lights of the federal building cast harsh shadows across the conference room walls as DeShawn Carter sat surrounded by towers of case files, each manila folder representing a life destroyed by Judge Eleanor Whitfield's corrupt courtroom. The overhead lighting illuminated every damning detail spread across the mahogany table, from sentencing records to bank statements that painted a picture of systematic oppression so profound it made her stomach turn. Agent Randall Cooper entered the room wearing a crisp navy suit with white dress shirt, his muscular frame filling the doorway as he carried another box of evidence. His expression was grim as he set the files down with a heavy thud that echoed through the sterile space. "Attorney General Carter, you need to see these latest cases," Cooper said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "We've uncovered 17 more instances of racial bias in sentencing just from the past 6 months. DeShawn Carter looked up from the files she'd been studying, her red blazer and black slacks, a stark contrast against the pale conference room walls. The natural skylight streaming through the windows highlighted the exhaustion etched across her face after weeks of reviewing Whitfield's judicial reign of terror. "Tell me about Marcus Williams first," she said, opening a thick folder that contained photographs of a young black man barely out of his teens. Cooper pulled out a chair and sat across from her, the fluorescent lighting reflecting off his bald head as he consulted his notes. 19 years old, caught with 2 grams of marijuana. First offense, honor student at community college, working part-time to support his younger sister. And Whitfield gave him 3 years in state prison. She called him a menace to society and said she was making an example of him. Cooper's jaw clenched as he flipped through the transcripts. Meanwhile, the same week, she gave probation to Tyler Morrison, a white college student caught with an ounce of cocaine and scales suggesting intent to distribute. The rage built slowly in DeShawn's chest as she studied Marcus Williams' photograph. He looked so young, so full of potential, his eyes bright with the kind of hope that Whitfield had systematically crushed. She could imagine his mother in the gallery that day, watching her son's future disappear because of one racist judge's twisted view of justice. "What happened to his education?" DeShawn asked, though she already knew the answer would break her heart. "Lost his financial aid, dropped out of school. His sister ended up in foster care because there was no one left to take care of her." Cooper's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "His mother, Patricia Williams, works 3 jobs now trying to pay for his appeals and support herself. We interviewed her last week." DeShawn closed her eyes and leaned back in her chair, the weight of systematic injustice pressing down on her shoulders like a physical force. Every file on this table represented not just one victim, but entire families torn apart by Whitfield's corruption. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their constant buzz becoming the soundtrack to her growing determination for justice. "Show me the Morrison case details," she said, steeling herself for more evidence of the double standard that had poisoned Whitfield's courtroom. Cooper slid another file across the polished table surface. The photographs showed a clean-cut white young man in an expensive suit, his lawyer clearly costing more than most families made in a year. The contrast with Marcus Williams' public defender was stark and deliberate. Tyler Morrison, son of a local businessman, caught with significantly more drugs and clear intent to sell. His lawyer argued he was experimenting and had bright prospects ahead of him. Cooper's voice dripped with disgust. Whitfield agreed, saying she didn't want to ruin a promising young man's future over a youthful indiscretion. While Marcus Williams was apparently born without a future worth protecting, DeShawn said bitterly, the hypocrisy so blatant it made her hands shake with anger. The conference room door opened as Detective Heather Lamb entered, wearing a black blazer over dark jeans, her blonde hair pulled back in a professional ponytail. She carried a digital tablet containing surveillance footage that would make their case even stronger. "Attorney General, I have the community impact interviews you requested," Lamb said, taking a seat at the head of the table where the natural skylight illuminated her serious expression. "Reverend Darnell Cruz has been documenting the effects of Whitfield's sentences on families in the community." "What did he find?" DeShawn asked, though she braced herself for more heartbreak. "Systematic destruction of black families through excessive incarceration," Lamb reported, consulting her tablet. "In cases involving identical charges, black defendants received sentences averaging 300% longer than white defendants. The economic impact on the community has been devastating." DeShawn stood and walked to the window where bright daylight streamed through the glass, illuminating the city below, where Whitfield's corruption had spread like cancer through the justice system. She could see the courthouse in the distance, its white columns standing as a mockery of the justice they were supposed to represent. "Tell me about Reverend Cruz's efforts to fight this," she said without turning around. "He's been filing complaints for 2 years," Lamb continued. "Every official channel, every bureaucratic avenue, every appeals process. They've been ignored, dismissed, or buried in red tape. The system protected itself by protecting Whitfield." Cooper opened another file, this one containing bank records that showed the financial motivation behind Whitfield's corruption. "We've traced over $200,000 in bribes and kickbacks to Whitfield's private accounts. Money from bail bondsmen who got preferred treatment, from private prison contractors who benefited from her harsh sentences, from wealthy defendants who bought their way out of consequences. While families like the Williams scraped together money for appeals that would never be heard fairly, DeShawn said, her voice hardening with resolve. "There's more," Detective Lamb said, her fingers dancing across the tablet screen. Defense attorney Tiffany Okafor has been documenting suspicious patterns in Whitfield's courtroom for months. She suspected corruption, but couldn't prove it without inside access. DeShawn turned back to face the room, the overhead fluorescent lighting casting sharp angles across her determined features. What kind of patterns? Closed-door meetings between Whitfield and prosecutor Winston Sato before cases involving black defendants. Sudden evidence dismissals that hurt the defense. Witnesses who mysteriously became unavailable or changed their testimony overnight. Lamb scrolled through her notes, each revelation adding another layer to the conspiracy. Cooper stood and began pacing the length of the conference room, his muscular frame tense with barely contained fury. Sato has been the inside man, feeding information to Whitfield about defense strategies while withholding exculpatory evidence that could free innocent defendants. How many innocent people are sitting in prison right now because of their conspiracy? DeShawn demanded, though she knew the answer would haunt her dreams. Conservative estimate? At least 37 cases where evidence was suppressed or manipulated, Cooper replied. Men and women serving time for crimes they didn't commit, or facing sentences far beyond what justice demanded. The weight of those 37 lives pressed down on DeShawn like a physical force. 37 families destroyed, 37 futures stolen, hundreds of children growing up without parents, spouses left alone, dreams crushed under the heel of systematic racism, disguised as judicial authority. "Show me the financial records on Sato," she said, settling back into her chair with renewed focus. Detective Lamb transferred files to the large screen mounted on the conference room wall, the bright fluorescent lighting making every detail crystal clear. Bank deposits, property purchases, and lifestyle improvements that far exceeded a prosecutor's salary painted a clear picture of corruption. Sato bought a $150,000 boat last year, paid cash, Lamb reported. His salary as a prosecutor is $68,000 annually. He also purchased a vacation home in Florida and enrolled his children in private schools, costing $30,000 per year each. Blood money? DeShawn said quietly. Every dollar built on the suffering of innocent families. Cooper returned to his seat and opened yet another file, this one containing photographs of community meetings where Reverend Cruz had tried to organize families affected by Whitfield's bias. The images showed packed church basements, overhead lighting, illuminating faces etched with grief and anger. Reverend Cruz has been holding weekly support meetings for families of Whitfield's victims, Cooper explained. Mothers whose sons received excessive sentences, fathers who lost jobs trying to pay for appeals, children who grew up visiting parents in prison for minor offenses. "I want to meet with him before we proceed," DeShawn decided. These families deserve to know that someone in power finally heard their cries for justice. The natural skylight dimmed slightly as clouds passed overhead, but the fluorescent lights maintained their harsh illumination of the evidence spread across the table. Each file represented not just corruption, but the deliberate destruction of human potential based solely on the color of skin. "There's something else," Detective Lamb said, her voice dropping to a more serious tone. "We've documented Whitfield's pattern of humiliating black attorneys in her courtroom. Defense attorney Okafor has experienced it firsthand multiple times." DeShawn's red blazer seemed to brighten under the lights as her anger sharpened into laser focus. What kind of humiliation? Forcing them to repeat statements multiple times, questioning their qualifications in front of clients, making them stand during entire proceedings while allowing white attorneys to remain seated, Lamb listed, consulting her tablet. Okafor documented 17 instances of discriminatory treatment just in the past year, building a pattern of racism that goes beyond just sentencing, Cooper added. This isn't unconscious bias. This is deliberate, systematic oppression, designed to intimidate black legal professionals and send a message about who has power in that courtroom. The conference room fell silent, except for the humming of the fluorescent lights overhead. Each person lost in contemplation of the evidence before them. The systematic nature of Whitfield's corruption was breathtaking in its scope and devastating in its impact. DeShawn stood again and walked to the evidence board, where photographs of victims were arranged in neat rows, their faces looking back at her with silent pleas for justice. Marcus Williams, barely 19 and full of potential. Sandra Mitchell, a single mother given excessive time for a nonviolent offense. David Chen, a college graduate whose life was derailed by prosecutorial misconduct. "This ends now," she said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of her office and the moral weight of justice long delayed. "Every family destroyed, every life ruined, every dream crushed by this corrupt system will be answered for." Cooper and Lamb exchanged glances, recognizing the determination that had made DeShawn Carter one of the most respected law enforcement officials in the country. The bright overhead lighting seemed to spotlight her resolve as she turned back to face them. "I'm going undercover into Whitfield's courtroom," she announced, the decision crystallizing in her mind as she spoke. "We need evidence of her corruption that's so blatant, so undeniable, that no appeals court or political connection can save her." "Attorney General, the personal risk," Cooper began, "is nothing compared to what Marcus Williams faced when Whitfield destroyed his future." DeShawn cut him off. "Nothing compared to what every family in Reverend Cruz's support group has endured while the system failed them." The natural skylight brightened again as the clouds passed, flooding the room with additional illumination that seemed to bless her decision. The evidence of corruption lay spread across the table like a roadmap to justice, each file pointing toward the confrontation that would finally break the chains of systematic oppression. "We're going to give Judge Eleanor Whitfield exactly what she's given so many others," DeShawn said with quiet determination. "A judgment day she'll never forget." The morning sun streamed through the tall courthouse windows as DeShawn Carter adjusted her red blazer and black slacks, transforming herself into just another defense attorney in Judge Eleanor Whitfield's courtroom. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in sharp relief, illuminating every detail of what would become her most dangerous undercover operation. She carried a worn leather briefcase and walked with the slightly hurried pace of an overworked public defender, her true identity as Attorney General buried beneath layers of careful preparation. 3 weeks had passed since she'd begun taking cases in Whitfield's courtroom, and already the patterns were undeniable. DeShawn Carter watched as Whitfield smiled warmly at white defense attorney Marcus Webb, nodding approvingly as he requested a continuance for his client, charged with assault. The same request DeShawn Carter had made yesterday for her black client had been denied with a sharp rebuke about wasting the court's time. "Your Honor," Marcus said with confidence, "my client needs additional time to prepare his defense." "Of course, Mr. Webb. 2 weeks should be sufficient," Whitfield replied, her voice honey-sweet. The contrast with how she'd spoken to DeShawn Carter the day before was stark. When DeShawn Carter had made the identical request, Whitfield's response had been venomous. "Mr. Webb, Carter, if you can't handle your caseload, perhaps you should find another profession." DeShawn Carter took detailed notes, documenting every interaction, every discrepancy, every moment that revealed the systematic bias poisoning this courtroom. The frustration burned in her chest, but she maintained her professional facade, knowing that each slight, each injustice was building towards something much larger. Court reporter Vivian Stanton caught DeShawn Carter's eye from her position near the judge's bench. Vivian was a thin woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, wearing a navy blue blouse and black pants. She'd been documenting Whitfield's corruption for months, waiting for someone with the power to act on her evidence. During a brief recess, Vivian approached DeShawn Carter with practiced casualness. "Ms. Carter, could I speak with you about some transcription questions?" Vivian asked, her voice carefully neutral. They moved to a quiet corner of the hallway, where Vivian discreetly slipped DeShawn Carter a small digital device. "Yesterday's Chambers conference," Vivian whispered. "Judge Whitfield didn't know I was still recording." DeShawn Carter pocketed the device, understanding the enormous risk Vivian was taking. "How long has this been going on?" 2 years since I started recording everything," Vivian replied, glancing around nervously. But the bias, the corruption, it goes back much further. I've seen families destroyed, young men's lives ruined because of her prejudice. I couldn't stay silent anymore. The weight of responsibility settled heavier on DeShawn Carter's shoulders. Each person willing to risk their career, their safety, to expose this corruption deserved justice. She squeezed Vivian's hand briefly. Your courage matters. We're going to stop this. Back in the courtroom, DeShawn Carter observed Detective Heather Lamb, positioned discreetly near the back, wearing civilian clothes that helped her blend with the court observers. Heather was a muscular woman in her 30s, with short brown hair, dressed in a gray sweater and dark jeans. Her sharp eyes missed nothing as she documented the patterns of intimidation and bias that defined Whitfield's courtroom. During lunch break, DeShawn Carter met with her client Terrell Washington, a 19-year-old college student charged with possession of marijuana. Terrell sat across from her in the small conference room, his hands shaking slightly as he wore a borrowed white button-down shirt and black slacks for court. His mother had scraped together money for bail, terrified her son would disappear into the system like so many others. Miss Carter, I've never been in trouble before, Terrell said, his voice barely above a whisper. I had one joint at a party, just one, but everyone's telling me Judge Whitfield is gonna throw the book at me because I'm black. DeShawn Carter felt her heart clench, seeing in Terrell every young black man who'd faced Whitfield's prejudiced gavel. Terrell, I want you to know that I'm fighting for you with everything I have. This system has failed too many young men like you, but I won't let it fail you. The afternoon session revealed even more disturbing patterns. DeShawn Carter watched as white defendant Jennifer Mills, charged with the same marijuana possession offense as Terrell, received a warm smile from Judge Whitfield. Jennifer stood before the bench in a pink sweater and khaki pants, her blonde hair styled perfectly, while her expensive attorney spoke on her behalf. Your Honor, Ms. Mills is a good student who made one mistake. The attorney argued. I can see that, Whitfield replied kindly. Community service and probation seem appropriate for a first offense. DeShawn Carter's jaw clenched as she prepared for Terrell's turn. The young man stood nervously beside her, his entire future hanging in the balance. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher now, casting stark shadows across Whitfield's face as her expression hardened upon seeing them approach. Miss Carter, Whitfield said, her voice dripping with disdain. I see you're here with another one of your clients who thinks rules don't apply to them. Your Honor, Mr. Washington is a first-time offender, an honor student at the community college. DeShawn Carter began, but Whitfield cut her off. I don't need his life story, counselor. Drug possession is a serious matter. I'm sentencing Mr. Washington to 60 days in county jail and 2 years probation. The disparity was breathtaking. For identical charges, Jennifer Mills received community service, while Terrell Washington faced jail time. DeShawn Carter watched Terrell's shoulders slump in defeat, his mother's quiet sob echoing from the gallery. The systematic destruction of black lives happening right before her eyes fueled her determination to see this through to the end. Agent Randall Cooper waited for DeShawn Carter in the courthouse parking lot, his tall frame leaning against an unmarked sedan. The late afternoon sun reflected off his aviator sunglasses as he wore a dark blue suit with a white shirt, looking every inch the federal investigator. His expression was grim as DeShawn Carter approached. How are you holding up? Randall asked, studying her face for signs of strain. Every day in that courtroom is like watching a slow-motion massacre, DeShawn Carter replied, exhaustion evident in her voice. But we're building something solid. Vivian's recordings, Heather's surveillance, the pattern evidence, it's all coming together. Randall nodded, opening the car door for her. The wiretaps on Whitfield's phone have picked up interesting conversations. She's been coordinating with Prosecutor Winston Sato to ensure certain outcomes. We have them discussing how to handle black defendants versus white ones. As they drove, DeShawn Carter reviewed the mounting evidence on her tablet, financial records showing unexplained deposits in Whitfield's accounts, surveillance photos of meetings with known criminals seeking favorable treatment, recorded conversations revealing racist attitudes and corrupt practices. The case was strong, but DeShawn Carter knew they needed something undeniable, something that would ensure conviction and prevent any possibility of Whitfield escaping justice. There's something else, Randall continued. We've identified at least 30 cases where Whitfield's bias directly affected sentencing, families destroyed, careers ruined, lives derailed because of her prejudice. The civil rights violations alone could put her away for decades. The personal cost of maintaining her cover weighed heavily on DeShawn Carter's mind. Each day of pretending to be powerless while witnessing injustice took its toll. She thought about her real position as Attorney General, the authority she wielded, the resources at her disposal, all hidden while young men like Terrell faced the consequences of Whitfield's hatred. That evening, DeShawn Carter reviewed Vivian's latest recording in her hotel room. Whitfield's voice came through clearly, discussing strategy with prosecutor Winston Sato in chambers after court had adjourned. "Winston, that Carter woman is getting on my nerves," Whitfield complained, "always defending these thugs like they deserve justice." "Maybe it's time to teach her a lesson," Sato replied. "Show her what happens when people don't know their place in my courtroom." "Exactly what I was thinking," Whitfield agreed. "These bleeding heart lawyers need to understand that some people are just naturally inferior. It's not discrimination, it's reality." The recording sent chills down DeShawn Carter's spine, not just for the overt racism, but for the clear threat against her safety. They were planning something, and she knew her cover was becoming increasingly dangerous. Defense attorney Tiffany Okafor met with DeShawn Carter the next morning before court, her concern evident as she wore a burgundy blazer and black skirt, her natural hair styled in professional lokes. Tiffany had been practicing in Whitfield's courtroom for 3 years, watching the bias destroy her clients while feeling powerless to stop it. "DeShawn, you need to be careful," Tiffany warned. "Yesterday after court, I heard Whitfield talking to the bailiff about making an example of uppity attorneys. I think she's targeting you specifically." "What kind of example?" DeShawn Carter asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Public humiliation. She's done it before to black attorneys who challenge her too directly, forces them to apologize, makes them grovel, sometimes worse. It's her way of asserting dominance and sending a message to the community." The strategic satisfaction of watching their case build was tempered by the growing danger. DeShawn Carter realized that Whitfield's need to dominate and humiliate could provide the final piece they needed, a public display of her racism and abuse of power, documented and witnessed, would seal her fate definitively. Agent Randall Cooper's voice crackled through DeShawn Carter's earpiece during lunch break. "We're picking up increased chatter. Whitfield is planning something big for this afternoon. Are you sure you want to go through with this?" DeShawn Carter looked around the courthouse cafeteria, seeing the faces of other attorneys, court staff, and family members of defendants, all of them deserving a justice system free from corruption and bias. "We've come too far to back down now. Whatever she has planned, it's going to be her downfall." The afternoon session felt charged with electricity. Bailiff Eugene Garrett seemed unusually nervous, shifting his weight as he stood in his short-sleeved uniform shirt and dark pants. His discomfort was palpable as he avoided eye contact with DeShawn Carter, clearly knowing something was about to happen, but conflicted about his role in it. Judge Whitfield entered with unusual ceremony, her black robes flowing dramatically as she took her seat. Her gray hair was perfectly styled, and her pale face held an expression of cold satisfaction. She surveyed the courtroom like a predator selecting prey, her gaze lingering on DeShawn Carter with unmistakable malice. "Miss Carter," Whitfield called out unexpectedly. "Approach the bench." DeShawn Carter felt the eyes of everyone in the courtroom following her as she walked forward. Detective Heather Lamb discreetly positioned herself for a better view, her hand near her concealed camera. Court reporter Vivian Stanton's fingers hovered over her equipment, ready to document whatever was about to unfold. The fluorescent lights seemed brighter now, illuminating every detail of what DeShawn Carter sensed would be the culmination of weeks of careful preparation. The evidence was overwhelming, the case was solid, and Whitfield was about to provide the final undeniable proof of her corruption and racism. As DeShawn Carter stood before the bench, she felt the weight of history on her shoulders. Every victim of Whitfield's bias, every family destroyed by her prejudice, Every young person whose future had been stolen, all of them deserved this moment of justice that was finally within reach. The anticipation in the courtroom was electric. Everyone seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen. Though only DeShawn Carter knew the true scope of what was unfolding, the chains of corruption that had bound this courthouse for too long were about to be shattered, and Judge Eleanor Whitfield was about to learn that justice, though delayed, could never be permanently denied. The fluorescent courtroom lights hummed overhead, casting their harsh white glow across every face in Judge Eleanor Whitfield's domain. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, creating an almost theatrical illumination that seemed to spotlight the unfolding drama. DeShawn Carter remained on her knees beside the mahogany bench, her red dress suit jacket wrinkled from the ordeal, her matching red blouse dampened with perspiration despite her outward composure. Judge Whitfield adjusted her black robes with theatrical flair, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the wooden surface of her elevated bench. The woman's gray hair was pulled back in its usual severe bun, and her pale eyes gleamed with a malicious satisfaction that made several observers shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Miss Carter," Whitfield's voice cut through the courtroom's tense silence like a blade. "I don't believe your apology was sufficient. Stand up and face this court properly." DeShawn Carter rose slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. Every muscle in her body screamed with tension, but her face remained a mask of professional composure. She had endured worse humiliations in her years fighting for justice, though none quite as public or as calculated as this moment. "Your Honor," DeShawn Carter began, her voice steady despite the tremor of rage building in her chest. "I have apologized for the disruption and cleaned the papers as requested." Whitfield's lips curled into a cruel smile that sent chills down the spines of everyone present. "Oh, but you see, Miss Carter, I don't think you understand the gravity of what you've done here today. You've contaminated my courtroom with your presence, your incompetence, and frankly, your kind of lawyering." The emphasis on "your kind" landed like a physical blow in the room. Defense attorney Tiffany Okafor, seated in the third row, wearing her crisp navy blue blazer and matching skirt, felt her stomach clench with disgust. Her dark hands tightened around her smartphone, which she kept discreetly angled to capture every moment of this horrific display. Bailiff Eugene Garrett stood at attention near the judge's bench, his muscular frame filling out his long-sleeved uniform shirt. The middle-aged black man's jaw worked silently as he watched the scene unfold, his years of service in this courtroom having shown him Judge Whitfield's bias before, but never anything approaching this level of brazen racism. Furthermore, Judge Whitfield continued, her voice rising with each word, "I believe a more thorough apology is in order. You will apologize to this court, to me personally, and to every person in this room for bringing your substandard representation into my domain." Prosecutor Winston Sato sat at his table, wearing a charcoal gray suit with a burgundy tie, his Asian features betraying nothing but satisfied indifference. He had witnessed Whitfield's treatment of black attorneys before, and had long ago decided that staying in her good graces was worth tolerating her excesses. His complicity had served him well in securing convictions and advancing his career. DeShawn Carter felt the weight of every gaze in the courtroom. The scattered journalists, the court staff, the few family members of defendants present for other cases, all staring at her humiliation. She thought of Agent Randall Cooper, positioned somewhere outside this building, coordinating the federal response that would soon arrive. She thought of Detective Heather Lamb, likely monitoring communications and ensuring all evidence was being properly documented. Most importantly, she thought of the dozens of black defendants who had suffered under Whitfield's racist system. "I apologize to the court," DeShawn Carter said, her voice carrying across the room with dignified strength. "I apologize for any disruption to these proceedings." "Not good enough," Whitfield snapped, rising from her chair with dramatic flair. "You will get back down on your knees and apologize properly. And while you're down there, you can clean the dust from my shoes with your bare hands. Perhaps that will teach you some humility." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Tiffany Okafor half rose from her seat, her mouth opening in protest, but Whitfield's gaze snapped to her like a predator spotting movement. "Defense attorney Okafor, if you say one word, I'll hold you in contempt and have you removed from my courtroom. In fact, I'll make sure you're sanctioned and reported to the Bar Association for interfering with judicial proceedings." Tiffany sank back into her seat, her heart pounding with rage and helplessness. Her fingers trembled as she continued recording, knowing that whatever happened next needed to be documented for history. Bailiff Eugene Garrett took a small step forward, his instincts as both a law enforcement officer and a decent human being warring with his need to maintain his job. He had worked in this courthouse for 15 years, had seen Judge Whitfield's gradual descent into more brazen displays of bias, but this crossed every line he had ever imagined. "Your Honor," Eugene said carefully, his deep voice carrying a note of professional concern, "perhaps we should take a brief recess to—" "Bailiff Garrett," Whitfield's voice cracked like a whip, "you will remain silent unless I address you directly. Your job is to maintain order in my courtroom, not to question my judicial decisions." Eugene's hands clenched at his sides, but he stepped back, his eyes meeting DeShawn Carter's for just a moment. In that brief exchange, she saw his shame, his anger, and his recognition that something fundamental was being violated in this room. DeShawn Carter slowly lowered herself back to her knees, the red fabric of her dress suit stretching as she knelt before the judge's bench. The position was designed to humiliate, to strip away every vestige of professional dignity and reduce her to a supplicant begging for mercy. "That's better," Whitfield said, her voice dripping with sadistic satisfaction. "Now, Miss Carter, I want you to understand something. In my courtroom, there is a natural order. There are people who belong here, who have earned the right to practice law through generations of breeding and education. And then there are people like you." The racist implications hung in the air like poison gas. Court reporter Vivian Stanton, a middle-aged white woman with graying brown hair, continued typing mechanically, her professional training demanding she record every word, even as her conscience recoiled. She thought of the secret recordings she had been making, the evidence she had been gathering for months, and wondered how much more documentation of evil the federal investigators would need. "You see," Whitfield continued, beginning to pace behind her bench like a professor delivering a lecture, "some people seem to think that affirmative action and social programs can overcome the natural limitations of genetics and culture. They believe that giving someone like you a law degree somehow makes you equal to attorneys who come from proper backgrounds." DeShawn Carter's hands pressed against the cold marble floor as she maintained her degrading position. Inside her chest, her heart hammered with a combination of rage and anticipation. Inside her chest, her heart hammered with a combination of rage and anticipation. Every word Judge Whitfield spoke was sealing her own fate more thoroughly than any federal prosecutor could have hoped for. "I want you to repeat after me, Miss Carter," Whitfield commanded, moving to stand directly in front of her bench so she could look down at the kneeling attorney. "Say, I am not qualified to practice law in Judge Whitfield's courtroom." The request sent shockwaves through the assembled observers. Tiffany Okafor felt tears of rage burn her eyes as she watched a fellow attorney, a woman she respected, being forced to demean herself in ways that violated every principle of legal ethics and human dignity. DeShawn Carter raised her head slightly, her dark eyes meeting Whitfield's pale ones with unwavering strength. "Your Honor, I have apologized for any disruption. I have followed your instructions to clean the courtroom floor. I believe we should now proceed with the legal matter at hand." Whitfield's face flushed red with anger at this display of quiet resistance. "You will say what I told you to say, or I will have you arrested for contempt of court. I will make sure you're disbarred and never practice law again anywhere in this state." The threat hung in the air like a blade poised to fall. Everyone in the courtroom understood they were witnessing something unprecedented, a complete abandonment of judicial restraint and professional ethics. The fluorescent lights seemed to buzz louder, as if the very building itself was protesting what was happening within its walls. Prosecutor Winston Sato leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He had always enjoyed watching Whitfield put uppity defense attorneys in their place, and seeing a black woman being humiliated so thoroughly gave him a perverse sense of satisfaction. His own advancement in the prosecutor's office had depended partly on his willingness to play along with Whitfield's biases. "Since you seem to need additional motivation," Whitfield said, her voice taking on an even more sinister tone, Let me make this crystal clear. You will clean my shoes with your bare hands. You will repeat the words I told you to say, and then you will thank me for the lesson in proper courtroom behavior." She stepped down from behind her bench, her black judicial robes swirling around her legs as she positioned herself directly in front of DeShawn Carter. Her expensive leather shoes, polished to a mirror shine, stopped just inches from where the attorney knelt. "Begin," Whitfield commanded. The courtroom held its collective breath. Tiffany Okafor's phone continued recording as her other hand covered her mouth in horror. Bailiff Eugene Garrett's muscular frame tensed as every instinct in his body screamed at him to intervene, while his professional training and economic necessity kept him frozen in place. DeShawn Carter looked at those polished shoes, symbols of power and privilege that Judge Whitfield was using to break her spirit. She thought about the young black men sitting in prison cells because of this woman's racism. She thought about the families torn apart by excessive sentences and biased rulings. She thought about the systematic corruption that had turned this courtroom into a theater of oppression. "Your Honor," DeShawn Carter said quietly, "I will not demean myself or my profession by performing this degrading act." The words landed in the courtroom like thunderbolts. Whitfield's face went white with shock, then flushed purple with rage. No one had ever defied her so directly, so completely, in her own domain. "How dare you," Whitfield hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "How dare you defy me in my own courtroom? Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? Do you understand the power I have over your pathetic little career?" She moved closer, looming over the kneeling attorney with predatory intensity. "I can destroy you with a phone call. I can make sure you never work as a lawyer again. I can have you arrested, prosecuted, and thrown in prison where you belong with the rest of your kind." The racist language was now completely unveiled, hanging in the air like a toxic cloud that contaminated everyone who heard it. Court reporter Vivian Stanton's fingers moved across her keys with mechanical precision, while her stomach churned with disgust. She had witnessed Whitfield's private racism for years, but seeing it displayed so publicly was beyond her worst expectations. "Since you refuse to show proper respect," Whitfield continued, her voice rising to fill every corner of the courtroom, "I'll teach you a lesson you'll never forget. You will clean my shoes, you will apologize for contaminating my courtroom with your presence, and you will thank me for allowing someone of your limited capabilities to appear before me." DeShawn Carter remained motionless, her hands pressed against the cold floor, her head held high despite her humiliating position. The strength radiating from her seemed to fill the courtroom, creating a strange contrast with her physical subjugation. "Furthermore," Whitfield said, beginning to pace in a small circle around the kneeling attorney, "I want everyone in this courtroom to understand what happens when certain people forget their place. This is what happens when affirmative action puts unqualified individuals in positions they were never meant to occupy." Tiffany Okafor felt her hands shaking as she continued recording. The video would soon be uploaded to social media platforms, where it would spread like wildfire and expose Judge Whitfield's racism to the world. But in this moment, she could only watch in horror as a colleague endured the ultimate professional humiliation. Bailiff Eugene Garrett's training warred with his conscience as he watched Judge Whitfield circle the kneeling attorney like a predator, toying with wounded prey. His job was to maintain order and protect the dignity of the court, but the person violating that dignity was the judge herself. "I'm waiting, Miss Carter," Whitfield said, stopping directly in front of her again. "Clean my shoes, apologize for your inadequacy, and thank me for the education I'm providing you today." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their harsh illumination ensuring that every detail of this degrading spectacle was clearly visible to all present. The morning sun continued streaming through the windows, as if nature itself was bearing witness to the corruption of justice taking place within these walls. DeShawn Carter slowly raised her head, her dark eyes meeting Judge Whitfield's pale ones with unshakable resolve. When she spoke, her voice carried across the courtroom with quiet dignity that made the racist judge's shrieking seem even more deranged by comparison. "Your Honor, I am an attorney admitted to practice law in this state. I have conducted myself professionally, despite extraordinary provocation. I will not participate in my own degradation, regardless of the consequences you threaten to impose. Whitfield's mouth fell open in shock. Never in her 20-year judicial career had anyone defied her so completely, so fearlessly. The black attorneys who appeared in her courtroom usually submitted to her abuse with quiet resignation, understanding that resistance would only make their clients' situations worse. "You insolent, arrogant," Whitfield began, then caught herself before uttering the racial slur that everyone in the room could see forming on her lips. "You have just guaranteed that your legal career is over. I will personally see to it that you are disbarred, prosecuted, and destroyed." She turned to address the courtroom, her black robes billowing dramatically as she gestured toward the kneeling attorney. "Let everyone present witness what happens when certain people are given opportunities beyond their natural capabilities. This woman represents everything wrong with our modern legal system." Prosecutor Winston Sato nodded approvingly from his seat, his satisfaction evident as he watched Judge Whitfield deliver what he considered a well-deserved comeuppance to an uppity defense attorney. His own career had prospered under Whitfield's favoritism, and he saw no reason to question a system that benefited him so handsomely. "Since you refuse to show proper respect," Whitfield continued, her voice taking on a theatrical quality as she played to her audience, "you will remain on your knees until you comply with my instructions. Court will remain in session until you learn your place." The threat of indefinite detention sent murmurs of concern through the scattered observers. Tiffany Okafor looked toward the courtroom doors, wondering if anyone outside was aware of the unprecedented abuse taking place within these walls. DeShawn Carter maintained her kneeling position with remarkable composure, though the strain was beginning to show in the slight tremor of her hands. She thought about Agent Randall Cooper and his federal task force, about the months of investigation and evidence gathering that had led to this moment. Every second of additional abuse would only strengthen the case against Judge Whitfield when the truth was finally revealed. "I have never seen such arrogance," Whitfield declared, her voice echoing off the courtroom walls. "Such complete disrespect for judicial authority. This woman actually believes she has the right to defy me in my own courtroom." She moved closer again, her expensive shoes clicking on the marble floor as she positioned herself to loom over the kneeling attorney. "Let me explain something to you, Miss Carter. In this courtroom, I am the ultimate authority. My word is law. When I give you an instruction, you follow it without question or hesitation." The power dynamic was stark and brutal. A white judge in her flowing black robes, standing over a black attorney, forced to kneel on the cold courtroom floor. The symbolism was so blatant, so historically resonant, that several observers felt physically sick watching it unfold. "Now," Whitfield said, her voice dropping to a menacing whisper, "you will clean my shoes with your bare hands, or I will have you arrested for contempt and thrown in jail until you rot." Bailiff Eugene Garrett felt his heart pounding as he realized he was being positioned to arrest a fellow professional for refusing to submit to racial humiliation. His hand moved unconsciously toward the handcuffs on his belt, then stopped as his conscience rebelled against what he was being asked to do. Court reporter Vivian Stanton continued transcribing every word, her professional mask hiding the turmoil in her stomach. The secret recordings she had been making for the federal investigation captured Judge Whitfield's private racism, but nothing compared to this public display of hatred and abuse of power. "Your silence speaks volumes," Whitfield taunted, beginning to pace again. "You can't even defend yourself because you know I'm right. You know you don't belong in this courtroom, don't belong in the legal profession at all." She stopped pacing and fixed her cold gaze on the kneeling attorney. "But I'm a generous woman. I'm going to give you one final opportunity to salvage what remains of your pathetic career. Clean my shoes, apologize for your inadequacy, thank me for my patience, and perhaps I'll only have you suspended instead of disbarred." The false mercy was even more insulting than the original demand. Tiffany Okafor found herself gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles had gone white, documenting every moment while fighting the urge to leap to her feet and physically intervene. DeShawn Carter remained silent, her head held high despite her degrading position. The strength radiating from her seemed to fill the entire courtroom, creating an almost mystical sense that something larger than this petty cruelty was at work. "Very well," Whitfield said finally, her voice carrying a note of grim satisfaction. "You have chosen your fate, Miss Carter. Bailiff Garrett, arrest this woman for contempt of court. I want her taken to jail immediately." Eugene Garrett felt his world spinning as he realized the moment of ultimate decision had arrived. His career, his pension, his family's security, all depended on following Judge Whitfield's orders. But his conscience, his sense of basic human decency, screamed at him to refuse. "Your Honor," he said carefully, his deep voice carrying across the tense courtroom. "Perhaps we should—" "Bailiff Garrett," Whitfield snapped, "you will follow my orders immediately, or you will find yourself unemployed and facing charges for dereliction of duty." The ultimatum hung in the air like a sword. Everyone in the courtroom understood they were witnessing the complete breakdown of judicial ethics and legal procedure. The fluorescent lights continued humming overhead, their harsh illumination ensuring every detail was captured in the recordings that would soon shock the world. Suddenly, the heavy courtroom doors opened with a sound that seemed to reverberate through the building like thunder. Bailiff Eugene Garrett looked toward the entrance, his relief evident as he saw salvation approaching in the form of serious-looking men in expensive suits. "Your Honor," Eugene said, his voice carrying a note of barely controlled anticipation, "we have visitors." Judge Whitfield turned toward the doors, irritation flashing across her face at this interruption to her sadistic theater. "Court is in session. Remove whoever." She stopped speaking as she recognized the unmistakable bearing of federal law enforcement officers. Agent Randall Cooper led a team of FBI agents into the courtroom, their credentials clearly visible, their expressions grimly professional. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted instantly, as if the very air had become electrified. Tiffany Okafor felt her heart leap with sudden hope as she realized that help had finally arrived. Court reporter Vivian Stanton's hands paused over her keys as she recognized that the moment of reckoning had come. DeShawn Carter remained kneeling on the cold marble floor, but now there was something different in her posture, a subtle shift that suggested the balance of power in the room was about to change dramatically. Judge Whitfield stood frozen behind her bench, her face draining of color as she realized that her private kingdom was about to be invaded by forces beyond her control. The racist abuse she had been hurling just moments before seemed to hang in the air like evidence of her coming downfall. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, illuminating what would soon be remembered as the final moments before justice finally arrived in Judge Eleanor Whitfield's corrupted courtroom. The heavy courtroom doors burst open with such force that they slammed against the walls, creating thunderous echoes that reverberated through the marble chamber. Judge Eleanor Whitfield's head snapped up from watching DeShawn Carter on her knees, her satisfied smirk faltering as she saw the line of men and women in dark suits flooding into her domain. Agent Randall Cooper led the procession, his muscular frame cutting an imposing figure in his navy blue suit and crisp white dress shirt. His polished black leather shoes clicked against the marble floor with military precision as he strode down the center aisle, followed by 6 other federal agents whose badges gleamed under the bright fluorescent lighting. Each agent moved with practiced authority, their positions strategically chosen to cover every exit. Bailiff Eugene Garrett's face had drained of all color as he recognized the federal badges. His hands trembled as he approached Judge Whitfield's bench, his voice barely above a whisper as he leaned toward her ear, but his words carried clearly through the suddenly silent courtroom. "Your Honor, these are federal agents, FBI. They're here for you." The wooden gavel slipped from Whitfield's manicured fingers, clattering onto the bench as the full meaning of those words sank in. Her pale blue eyes darted frantically between the agents and the woman still kneeling on her courtroom floor, confusion and the first tendrils of fear beginning to twist her features. DeShawn Carter, slowly, deliberately, began to rise from her position on the cold marble floor. Every movement was controlled, dignified, despite the papers scattered around her and the red stains on her palms from where Whitfield's heel had ground into her skin. She brushed off her red dress suit with calm precision, smoothing the fabric of her matching red blazer and adjusting her black dress pants as she stood to her full height. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the submissive posture, forced upon her by Whitfield's abuse. In its place stood a woman of unmistakable authority, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted, her dark eyes blazing with quiet triumph. The bright overhead lighting seemed to illuminate her like a spotlight, casting her as the central figure in this unfolding drama. Judge Whitfield. DeShawn Carter's voice rang out clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the hushed courtroom. Allow me to properly introduce myself. She reached into her red blazer and withdrew a leather credential wallet, flipping it open to reveal the golden badge within. The metal caught the fluorescent light and threw gleaming reflections across the courtroom walls. I am DeShawn Carter, Attorney General of the United States of America. The courtroom erupted. Gasps echoed from the gallery as spectators rose from their seats. Defense attorney Tiffany Okafor's mouth fell open in shock, her phone still recording as she captured every moment of the revelation. Court reporter Vivian Stanton's fingers froze above her stenotype machine, her eyes wide with amazement. Judge Eleanor Whitfield's face underwent a terrifying transformation. The confusion melted away, replaced first by disbelief, then by dawning horror, as the full magnitude of her situation crashed down upon her like a tidal wave. Her pale complexion turned ashen, then took on a sickly green tinge. Her hands gripped the edges of her bench so tightly that her knuckles went white. "That's impossible," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the courtroom murmur. "You're just some nobody public defender. You're nobody." DeShawn Carter stepped forward, her red heels clicking against the marble as she approached the bench where Whitfield sat, frozen in shock. Her voice remained calm, professional, but carried an unmistakable edge of steel. "For the past 6 months, I have been conducting an undercover federal investigation into systematic corruption, civil rights violations, and obstruction of justice in this courtroom. What you have witnessed today, what you have participated in, represents the culmination of extensive surveillance, documentation, and evidence gathering." Agent Randall Cooper moved to DeShawn Carter's side, his presence adding weight to her words. His deep voice carried clearly through the courtroom as he addressed the trembling judge. "Judge Eleanor Whitfield, you are under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights, accepting bribes, obstruction of justice, witness intimidation, and federal hate crime charges. The evidence against you includes months of surveillance footage, audio recordings, financial records, and now the direct testimony of the Attorney General herself." Whitfield's breathing became rapid and shallow. She looked around desperately, as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. Her gaze fell upon Prosecutor Winston Sato, who had been sitting in stunned silence at the prosecution table. "Winston," she called out desperately, "tell them this is some kind of mistake. Tell them I never took any money." But Sato was already rising from his chair, his face pale with terror, as he realized his own involvement was about to be exposed. He grabbed his briefcase and headed for the side exit, moving as quickly as his legs could carry him without breaking into an obvious run. He never made it to the door. Detective Heather Lamb stepped out from her position near the courthouse security station, her police uniform replaced by a sharp black pantsuit that revealed her true identity. Her muscular frame blocked Sato's path as she displayed her own federal credentials. "Winston Sato, you're under arrest as a co-conspirator in this corruption scheme. We have evidence of your participation in bribery, your deliberate sabotage of cases involving black defendants, and your systematic withholding of exculpatory evidence." Sato's briefcase tumbled to the floor, papers scattering across the marble as Detective Lamb efficiently secured his hands behind his back with steel handcuffs. His face crumpled as he realized there would be no escape from the web of evidence that had been methodically constructed around him. Back at the bench, Judge Whitfield was hyperventilating. The woman who had wielded absolute power in her courtroom just minutes earlier was now reduced to a quivering mess, her black judicial robes seeming to hang loose and ill-fitting on her shrinking frame. "Please," she gasped, looking up at DeShawn Carter with desperate pleading eyes. "Please, I didn't know. I never meant for any of this to happen. It was just small favors, just little things that didn't matter." DeShawn Carter's expression remained impassive as she listened to the woman who had just forced her to crawl on the floor like an animal. When Whitfield finished her babbling excuses, DeShawn Carter's response was delivered with quiet, devastating precision. "Judge Whitfield, In the past hour alone, you have committed federal hate crimes that were witnessed by an entire courtroom. You forced the Attorney General of the United States to kneel and clean your floor while calling her racially derogatory names. You ground your heel into my hand while making statements about putting people like me in their place. You demanded that I polish your shoes and apologize for contaminating your courtroom. Each word landed like a physical blow. Whitfield's face crumpled further with every accusation, the reality of her actions and their consequences finally sinking in completely. But beyond today's horrific display, DeShawn Carter continued, our investigation has uncovered years of systematic abuse. We have documented your acceptance of over $200,000 in bribes from defendants seeking favorable sentences. We have recordings of you coordinating with Prosecutor Sato to ensure harsher penalties for black defendants, while arranging plea deals and reduced sentences for white defendants who paid you. Agent Cooper stepped forward with a thick manila folder, opening it to reveal photographs and documents. We have financial records showing suspicious deposits into offshore accounts. We have testimony from witnesses you attempted to intimidate. We have video evidence of meetings where you accepted cash payments in exchange for judicial favors. Defense attorney Tiffany Okafor had moved closer, her phone capturing every moment of Whitfield's breakdown. Her voice shook with emotion as she spoke up from the gallery. I've suspected something was wrong for years. The disparities in sentencing, the way you treated black attorneys and defendants differently. But I never imagined it was this systematic, this deliberately cruel. Court reporter Vivian Stanton finally found her voice, standing up from her position near the bench. I have recordings, she announced, her words carrying clearly through the courtroom. Years of recordings from chambers conferences where Judge Whitfield made racist statements and discussed which defendants had paid her and which ones deserved lessons in respect. The walls were closing in from every direction. Whitfield looked around frantically, but every face she saw reflected disgust, anger, or satisfaction at her downfall. Even bailiff Eugene Garrett, who had served in her courtroom for years, was shaking his head in revulsion. This can't be happening, Whitfield whispered, her voice breaking. I'm a federal judge. I have tenure. You can't just arrest me like some common criminal. DeShawn Carter's laugh was cold and sharp. Your tenure protects you from removal for political reasons, Judge Whitfield. It does not protect you from criminal prosecution for federal crimes, and it certainly doesn't protect you from the consequences of assaulting and humiliating the Attorney General while committing hate crimes in front of witnesses. Agent Cooper approached the bench with handcuffs, their metallic click echoing through the silent courtroom as he prepared to formally arrest the woman who had once wielded absolute power within these walls. Judge Eleanor Whitfield, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Whitfield's voice rose to a near shriek as the reality of handcuffs approaching her wrists finally broke through her shock. Wait, please. I can make this right. I can fix the sentences. I can return the money. Please, Attorney General Carter. Surely we can work something out. The desperation in her voice was palpable, but DeShawn Carter's expression remained unmoved. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of absolute finality. Judge Whitfield, for years you have destroyed lives, torn apart families, and perverted the very foundations of justice itself. You have used your position to spread hatred and discrimination while enriching yourself through corruption. The time for mercy was before you chose to humiliate me in front of this courtroom. The time for deals was before you decided to grind your heel into my hand while spewing racist venom. The handcuffs clicked into place around Whitfield's wrists, and the sound seemed to echo through the courtroom like a judge's gavel delivering a final verdict. The woman who had sat on high, dispensing biased justice and racist abuse, was now just another defendant facing the consequences of her crimes. As Agent Cooper and his team escorted both Whitfield and Sato toward the courtroom doors, Whitfield's legs seemed to give out. She stumbled, nearly falling, and had to be supported by the federal agents as they guided her toward the exit. This isn't over, she called out desperately over her shoulder, her voice echoing off the marble walls. I know people. I have connections. "I'll fight this." DeShawn Carter's response followed her to the doors, clear and uncompromising. "Judge Whitfield, your connections are about to become your co-defendants. This investigation extends far beyond just you and Prosecutor Sato. Justice has only just begun." The heavy courtroom doors closed behind the arrested conspirators, leaving the chamber in stunned silence. DeShawn Carter stood in the center of the room, no longer the humiliated victim forced to crawl on the floor, but revealed as the architect of justice who had orchestrated this entire confrontation. The transformation was complete. The chains of corruption that had bound this courtroom for years had been shattered, and the woman who had endured racist abuse and humiliation was revealed as the most powerful law enforcement officer in the nation. In the gallery, spectators began to applaud, the sound building from scattered clapping to thunderous ovation as the full impact of what they had witnessed began to sink in. Justice had not only been served, it had been delivered with precision, patience, and devastating effectiveness. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Agent Randall Cooper stepped forward, his muscular frame commanding attention in his crisp navy suit and white dress shirt. The courtroom had fallen into stunned silence, broken only by the soft clicking of handcuffs as federal agents continued securing the scene. Judge Eleanor Whitfield sat slumped in her chair behind the bench, her black judicial robes now seeming like a costume rather than a symbol of authority. DeShawn Carter stood tall in the center of the courtroom, her red blazer and matching pencil skirt immaculate despite the ordeal she had just endured. The natural skylight streaming through the tall windows seemed to spotlight her as she brushed an invisible speck of dust from her sleeve, her dignity fully restored. The transformation was remarkable. Moments ago she had been kneeling on the floor, subjected to the most vile racist abuse. Now she commanded the room with the quiet authority that came with her true position as Attorney General. "Ladies and gentlemen," Agent Cooper announced, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom, "what you have witnessed today is the culmination of an 18-month federal investigation into systematic corruption, civil rights violations, and obstruction of justice." He gestured toward DeShawn Carter with obvious respect. Attorney General Carter volunteered to go undercover to gather the evidence we needed to expose this conspiracy. A collective gasp rose from the gallery as the full weight of the revelation sank in. Defense attorney Tiffany Okafor, still recording on her phone, zoomed in to capture Whitfield's face as the color drained from it completely. The judge's hands trembled as she gripped the edges of her desk, her knuckles white with tension. "This can't be happening," Whitfield whispered, her voice barely audible. "This is some kind of mistake, some kind of setup." Court reporter Vivian Stanton stood up from her position, removing a small recording device from beneath her desk. She was a petite woman in her 50s, wearing a navy blue cardigan over khaki pants, and her hands shook slightly as she held up the device. "Your Honor," she said, her voice stronger than anyone expected, "I've been documenting everything, every racist comment, every bribe, every threat. It's all here." Agent Cooper nodded approvingly and took the device. "Ms. Stanton has been cooperating with our investigation for the past 6 months. She's recorded over 40 hours of conversations that will serve as evidence in this case." Whitfield's eyes darted frantically around the courtroom, searching for an escape that didn't exist. "Vivian, you can't do this to me. We've worked together for 15 years. 15 years. 15 years of watching you destroy innocent lives," Vivian replied, her voice gaining strength. 15 years of typing transcripts where you gave excessive sentences to black defendants while letting white criminals walk free. I couldn't stay silent anymore. DeShawn Carter stepped forward, her heels clicking authoritatively on the marble floor. The overhead fluorescent lights caught the determination in her dark eyes as she looked directly at Whitfield. "Judge Whitfield, you forced me to kneel on this floor. You ground your heel into my hand. You called me names that have no place in any civilized society, let alone a court of law. But more importantly, you've been doing this to my people for years." The courtroom doors opened with a loud bang, and Reverend Darnell Cruz entered, leading a group of community members. The Reverend was a distinguished man in his 60s, wearing a charcoal gray suit with a purple dress shirt, and his presence seemed to fill the room with hope. Behind him came families whose lives had been shattered by Whitfield's corruption, their faces a mixture of pain and vindication. Attorney General Carter, Reverend Cruz, called out, his deep voice resonating through the courtroom. This community owes you a debt we can never repay. Among the families was Maria Thompson, a single mother whose 19-year-old son had received 10 years for a minor drug possession charge. She wore a simple black dress and clutched a photograph of her son to her chest. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at Whitfield with a mixture of anger and relief. My baby got 10 years for having 2 grams of marijuana, Maria said, her voice breaking. 2 grams. While that white boy who had cocaine and a gun got probation, you destroyed my family. Whitfield tried to stand, but her legs gave out beneath her. She collapsed back into her chair, the weight of her crimes finally crushing down upon her. I was just following the law, she stammered weakly. Following the law. DeShawn Carter's voice rose with controlled fury. Agent Cooper, please share with everyone what our investigation uncovered. Agent Cooper opened a thick manila folder, the papers rustling in the tense silence. Our investigation revealed that over the past 8 years, Judge Whitfield has accepted over $200,000 in bribes from various sources. She has consistently given harsher sentences to black defendants while showing leniency to white defendants for identical crimes. The statistical disparity is so dramatic that it could only be the result of deliberate bias. He continued reading from his notes. African American defendants in Judge Whitfield's courtroom received sentences averaging 43% longer than white defendants for the same crimes. She also dismissed cases against wealthy white defendants at a rate 5 times higher than cases involving black defendants. The evidence was overwhelming, and the courtroom buzzed with angry murmurs. Tiffany Okafor continued filming, knowing that this moment needed to be preserved for history. She wore a burgundy blazer over black slacks, and her usually composed demeanor showed cracks of emotion as she witnessed justice finally being served. Furthermore, Agent Cooper continued, Prosecutor Winston Sato has been complicit in this conspiracy, deliberately withholding exculpatory evidence in cases involving black defendants while providing extensive plea deals to white defendants. All eyes turned to Winston Sato, who had been trying to edge toward a side exit. Detective Heather Lamb, dressed in a black pantsuit that concealed her true role as an undercover officer, blocked his path with a firm hand on his shoulder. Mr. Sato, Detective Lamb announced, producing her own set of handcuffs. You're under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations. Sato's face went ashen as he realized his escape attempt had failed. This is ridiculous. I was just doing my job. Judge Whitfield made the sentencing decisions, not me. Actually, DeShawn Carter interjected, holding up a stack of documents. We have emails between you and Judge Whitfield discussing which cases to handle appropriately. Your words, not mine. You actively participated in denying justice to countless families. The courtroom erupted as more families recognized the scope of the corruption. James Mitchell, whose 22-year-old nephew had been sentenced to 15 years for armed robbery, while a white defendant got 5 years for the same charge, stood up from his seat in the gallery. My nephew Marcus has been in prison for 6 years because of you people, James shouted, pointing at both Whitfield and Sato. 6 years stolen from his life because of your hatred. Reverend Cruz raised his hand, calling for calm. Brothers and sisters, today we witness justice, not vengeance but justice. Let us remember that this moment belongs to truth, not to anger. DeShawn Carter nodded gratefully to the Reverend before addressing the room again. The crimes committed in this courtroom extend far beyond individual cases. This was a systematic effort to deny equal justice under the law to an entire community. Judge Whitfield didn't just sentence individuals. She sentenced families, neighborhoods, and generations to suffer the consequences of her hatred. Vivian Stanton approached the bench, her small frame dwarfed by the massive wooden structure. Your Honor, she said, addressing Whitfield directly, I want you to know that I recorded the conversation where you laughed about sending another one of them away for 20 years. A 20-year-old kid whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. You laughed about destroying his life." Whitfield's composure finally cracked completely. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "I never meant for it to go this far," she whispered through her tears. "The money, the pressure, it just snowballed." "The money." DeShawn Carter stepped closer to the bench, her voice sharp with accusation. "This wasn't just about money, Judge Whitfield. The recordings we have show your true feelings about black people. You used the most vile language imaginable when discussing defendants. You called us animals, criminals, and worse things I won't repeat in this sacred space." Agent Cooper signaled to his team, and 2 more federal agents approached the bench. "Judge Eleanor Whitfield, you are under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights, bribery, obstruction of justice, and abuse of process under color of law." The handcuffs clicked into place around her wrists as he read her rights. The sound of the handcuffs seemed to reverberate through the courtroom like a bell tolling for justice. Bailiff Eugene Garrett, who had witnessed so much corruption but felt powerless to stop it, finally spoke up. "Attorney General Carter," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I knew something was wrong for years. I should have spoken up sooner. I should have protected those people." DeShawn Carter looked at the bailiff with understanding rather than judgment. Eugene was in his late 50s, wearing his standard court uniform of navy pants and a light blue shirt, and his face showed the weight of years of complicity through silence. "Mr. Garrett, fear of retaliation keeps many good people silent. What matters is that the truth came out eventually. Your cooperation in this investigation has been valuable." The courtroom doors opened again, and Judge Harriet Dunning entered. She was a distinguished black woman in her early 60s, wearing a navy blue suit with a cream-colored blouse, and she carried herself with the quiet dignity befitting her new role. Her appointment to replace Whitfield had been expedited, given the circumstances. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Dunning announced, her voice commanding immediate respect, "this courtroom has been tainted by corruption and hatred, but today we begin the process of healing and restoration. Justice delayed is not justice denied when truth finally prevails." The crowd rose to their feet, applauding as Whitfield was led away in handcuffs. Her black judicial robes seemed to mock her now, a reminder of the sacred trust she had violated. Sato followed behind her, his head hung in shame as the weight of his crimes became undeniable. Tiffany Okafor lowered her phone, having captured every moment of the historic scene. "Attorney General Carter," she called out, "this video is going to show the world what really happens in courtrooms across America. This corruption isn't isolated to one judge or one prosecutor." DeShawn Carter nodded solemnly. "That's exactly why we needed to do this publicly. Hidden corruption thrives in darkness. Today we shine light on the systematic denial of justice that has plagued our communities for too long." Reverend Cruz approached DeShawn Carter, extending his hand in gratitude. "Sister Carter, you put yourself at tremendous personal risk to expose this evil. Your courage will inspire generations of young people to fight for justice." The community members began sharing their stories, their voices finally being heard in a courtroom that had silenced them for so long. Maria Thompson approached DeShawn Carter, with tears still streaming down her face. "My son is going to come home now, isn't he?" Maria asked, hope breaking through her voice like sunshine after a storm. "Mrs. Thompson," DeShawn Carter replied gently, "every case that passed through this courtroom will be reviewed. Your son and dozens of other young people will have their cases reconsidered by impartial judges. Justice is coming." As the federal agents finished securing the scene and removing the corrupt officials, Judge Dunning called for order. "This court is now in recess, pending a full review of all cases heard in this courtroom. Over the past 8 years, notices will be sent to all affected parties regarding appeals and case reviews." The natural skylight streaming through the tall windows seemed brighter now, as if the very atmosphere of the courtroom had been cleansed. DeShawn Carter stood in the center of the room, surrounded by community members whose lives had been forever changed by this moment of justice. Detective Lamb approached DeShawn Carter as the crowd began to disperse. "Attorney General, the media is already picking up the story. Tiffany's video is spreading across social media platforms faster than we can track. Good, DeShawn Carter replied firmly. The world needs to see what systematic racism looks like in practice. They need to understand that corruption wears robes and sits behind benches, making decisions that destroy lives based on nothing more than hatred and greed. As the last of the community members filed out of the courtroom, Reverend Cruz lingered behind with DeShawn Carter. Sister, what you did today required more than courage. It required a willingness to suffer personally for the greater good. That's the spirit of true leadership. DeShawn Carter looked around the empty courtroom, seeing it with new eyes. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, but their harsh glare no longer seemed oppressive. Instead, they illuminated a space where truth had finally conquered lies, where justice had prevailed over hatred. Reverend Cruz, she said softly, the real heroes are the families who suffered in silence for years, and the people like Vivian who found the courage to speak truth to power. I just had the privilege of being the instrument of their justice. The chains of corruption had finally been broken, and healing could begin. 3 months after that fateful day in the courtroom, DeShawn Carter stood before another judge, but this time the fluorescent lights of the federal courthouse illuminated her red blazer and black dress pants as she prepared to deliver the testimony that would seal Eleanor Whitfield's fate forever. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the packed courtroom where reporters, victims' families, and community leaders had gathered to witness justice finally being served. Agent Randall Cooper adjusted his navy blue suit jacket as he watched from the gallery, his muscular frame tense with anticipation. Months of investigation had led to this moment, and every piece of evidence they had gathered would finally see the light of day. Beside him sat defense attorney Tiffany Okafor, her orange blouse bright under the courtroom lights, her phone ready to document this historic moment for the world to see. The prosecution calls Attorney General DeShawn Carter to the stand, announced the federal prosecutor, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom. DeShawn Carter rose gracefully, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she walked to the witness stand. Her posture was erect, her head held high, a stark contrast to the broken woman who had been forced to kneel just 3 months earlier. Behind the defense table, Eleanor Whitfield sat hunched in her orange prison jumpsuit, her once commanding presence reduced to that of a defeated criminal awaiting her sentence. After being sworn in, DeShawn Carter faced the packed courtroom, her voice steady and strong as she began her testimony. Your Honor, what I experienced in Eleanor Whitfield's courtroom was not just personal humiliation, but a window into decades of systematic corruption that destroyed countless lives and families. The federal prosecutor nodded, adjusting his gray suit as he approached the witness stand. Attorney General Carter, please tell the court what you witnessed during your undercover investigation. DeShawn Carter's eyes swept across the courtroom, taking in the faces of victims' families who had waited years for this moment. I witnessed a judge who had turned the scales of justice into instruments of oppression. Eleanor Whitfield didn't just take bribes or show favoritism. She weaponized her courtroom against black defendants and attorneys with a cruelty that defied every principle of American jurisprudence. In the gallery, Reverend Darnell Cruz leaned forward in his dark blue suit, his weathered hands clasped in prayer. Behind him sat dozens of family members whose loved ones had been sentenced unfairly by Whitfield's corrupt court. Many wore their Sunday best, treating this day like the sacred moment of vindication it truly was. The day she forced me to kneel and clean papers from her courtroom floor, DeShawn Carter continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. Eleanor Whitfield revealed the depths of her corruption and racism. She ground her heel into my hand while calling me names that have no place in any civilized society, let alone a court of law. Whitfield's defense attorney, a nervous man in an ill-fitting brown suit, shifted uncomfortably as murmurs rippled through the courtroom. His client had refused to take a plea deal, convinced that her connections would protect her even now. But what happened to me was just one moment, DeShawn Carter said, her red blazer catching the light as she gestured toward the gallery. The real tragedy is what happened to the hundreds of defendants who appeared before her over the years. Young men given decades in prison for crimes that should have warranted probation. families torn apart by excessive sentences, dreams destroyed by a system that was supposed to protect them. The federal prosecutor presented evidence as DeShawn Carter testified, including court reporter Vivian Stanton's secret recordings, financial records showing bribes, and statistics proving racial bias in sentencing. Each piece of evidence built upon the next, creating an overwhelming case of corruption that reached into every corner of the judicial system. We discovered that this wasn't just about one corrupt judge, DeShawn Carter explained, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom. Prosecutor Winston Sato actively participated by withholding evidence from black defendants while offering plea deals to white defendants charged with similar crimes. Bailiff Eugene Garrett, while conflicted, allowed the abuse to continue through his silence. From his seat in the defendant's section, Winston Sato stared at the floor, his orange prison jumpsuit, a reminder of how far he had fallen. His trial had concluded the previous month, resulting in a 10-year sentence for his role in the conspiracy. The investigation revealed over 200 cases that require review, DeShawn Carter continued. Families who lost sons, fathers and brothers to a system that was rigged against them from the moment they walked into that courtroom. Detective Heather Lamb, now back in her regular police uniform of navy blue shirt and matching pants, watched from the law enforcement section as DeShawn Carter detailed the extensive undercover operation. Her work documenting bribes and witness intimidation had been crucial to building the federal case. As DeShawn Carter's testimony continued, the weight of Whitfield's crimes became undeniable. The packed courtroom listened in rapt attention as she described not just the personal humiliation she endured, but the systematic destruction of justice that had occurred under Whitfield's gavel. "What struck me most," DeShawn Carter said, her voice now carrying a note of profound sadness, was how normalized the corruption had become. Court staff, attorneys, even some defendants seemed to accept that this was just how the system worked. That level of institutional decay doesn't happen overnight. The defense attorney made a feeble attempt at cross-examination, trying to suggest that DeShawn Carter's undercover operation was entrapment, but his arguments crumbled under the weight of evidence. Whitfield had revealed her corruption willingly, enthusiastically even, believing she was untouchable. "Your Honor," the defense attorney said, tugging at his brown tie nervously, "my client was simply maintaining order in her courtroom according to her interpretation of judicial authority." A collective gasp arose from the gallery as the absurdity of the defense became clear. DeShawn Carter remained composed on the witness stand, but her eyes flashed with controlled anger at the attempt to justify racial humiliation as judicial order. "I would respectfully submit," DeShawn Carter responded when asked to comment, "that no legitimate interpretation of judicial authority includes forcing officers of the court to kneel and endure racist abuse while cleaning floors. That was not justice. That was cruelty masquerading as power." After hours of testimony, DeShawn Carter stepped down from the witness stand, but the impact of her words continued to reverberate through the courtroom. Reporters frantically took notes while sketch artists captured the historic moment. This wasn't just a corruption trial. It was a reckoning with systematic injustice that had festered for decades. Judge Marcus Wellington, a distinguished black man in his 60s wearing traditional black robes, reviewed the evidence with the gravity the moment deserved. His appointment to oversee this federal trial had been deliberate, sending a message that justice would be both served and seen to be served. "The evidence presented in this case," Judge Wellington announced, his deep voice carrying the weight of judicial authority, "reveals corruption so extensive and malicious that it strikes at the very foundation of our legal system. The defendant's actions weren't mere lapses in judgment, but calculated attacks on the constitutional rights of citizens based on race." Eleanor Whitfield finally looked up from the defense table, her once proud face now etched with the reality of her situation. Gone was the arrogant judge who had terrorized her courtroom. In her place sat a broken woman facing the consequences of decades of corruption and hatred. "Eleanor Whitfield," Judge Wellington continued, "you have been found guilty on all counts including civil rights violations, bribery, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. Your actions brought shame not only upon yourself, but upon every judge who has ever worn the robes of office." The courtroom held its collective breath as Judge Wellington prepared to announce the sentence. DeShawn Carter sat in the front row, her red blazer a symbol of the courage that had brought this moment to pass. Around her, victims' families clutched each other's hands, finally about to see justice delivered. "It is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to 15 years in federal prison," Judge Wellington announced, his gavel coming down with finality that echoed through the packed courtroom. The gallery erupted in a mixture of cheers, tears, and applause. Families who had waited years for this moment embraced each other as Whitfield was led away in shackles, her orange jumpsuit a stark reminder of how completely her world had changed. But the real victory extended far beyond Whitfield's sentence. Over the following weeks, DeShawn Carter worked tirelessly to ensure that justice reached every corner of the corrupted system. Case reviews led to the release of 37 wrongly sentenced defendants, with dozens more receiving reduced sentences or new trials. The federal investigation expanded, revealing a network of corruption that had infected multiple courts. Millions of dollars in restitution flowed to victims and their families, providing some measure of financial compensation for years of injustice, though no amount of money could truly restore the lost time and shattered dreams. Reverend Darnell Cruz organized community healing events in his church, the overhead fluorescent lights illuminating faces that had carried pain for too long. His dark blue suit became a familiar sight at these gatherings as families shared their stories and began the long process of rebuilding trust in the system. "We gather not in hatred," Reverend Cruz proclaimed from his pulpit, his voice carrying the wisdom of years spent fighting injustice, but in the hope that truth and courage can still prevail over corruption and hatred. Defense attorney Tiffany Okafor used her newfound platform to establish a legal aid clinic specifically for victims of judicial bias. Her bright orange blouses became a symbol of hope in courtrooms throughout the city as she worked to ensure that no family would face the system alone again. The law is supposed to be a shield for the innocent and a sword against injustice, she told a gathering of young lawyers in a brightly lit conference room. What we witnessed with Eleanor Whitfield was the perversion of that sacred trust. Our job is to restore it. Judge Harriet Dunning, appointed to replace Whitfield, immediately implemented sweeping reforms. Cameras were installed in courtrooms, bias training became mandatory for all court staff, and a civilian oversight board was established to investigate complaints. Her gray suit and no-nonsense demeanor signaled a new era of transparency and accountability. The changes weren't just procedural. Detective Heather Lamb worked with community leaders to establish better relationships between law enforcement and the neighborhoods that had been most affected by the corruption. Her navy blue police uniform, once viewed with suspicion in certain communities, began to represent the possibility of fair treatment under the law. Agent Randall Cooper's investigation expanded beyond the courthouse, revealing connections between Whitfield's corruption and other institutions. His muscular frame and determined demeanor became familiar sights as he testified before congressional committees about the need for federal oversight of local judicial systems. 6 months after Whitfield's sentencing, DeShawn Carter stood in the same community where many of her victims had lived, but now the scene was transformed. Instead of families mourning the loss of loved ones to unjust sentences, she witnessed homecomings as wrongly convicted men returned to their communities. The afternoon sun cast warm light across the neighborhood as Marcus Thompson embraced his mother for the first time in 8 years. His case had been one of Whitfield's most egregious examples of bias. Sentenced to decades in prison for a nonviolent drug offense that should have warranted treatment, not incarceration. "I thought I'd never see this day," Marcus's mother whispered, tears streaming down her face as neighbors gathered to welcome him home. "I never stopped believing in his innocence, but the system seemed so big, so impossible to fight." DeShawn Carter watched from a respectful distance, her red dress bright under the natural lighting. This was why she had endured the humiliation in Whitfield's courtroom, not for personal vindication, though that had been satisfying, but for moments like this when families were reunited and justice was finally served. Attorney General Carter called a reporter, approaching with her camera crew. "How do you feel seeing the impact of your investigation?" DeShawn Carter considered the question carefully before responding. "What you're witnessing here isn't just the result of one investigation or one person's courage. This is what happens when a community refuses to accept injustice as normal. When people like Reverend Cruz, Attorney Okafor, and countless others work together to demand better from their institutions. The reporter pressed for more personal reflection. But surely you take some satisfaction in seeing Eleanor Whitfield brought to justice after what she put you through? Eleanor Whitfield's downfall was never the goal, DeShawn Carter replied, her voice carrying the wisdom earned through the struggle. The goal was always to restore justice to a system that had lost its way. Her conviction was necessary, but it was just the beginning of the real work. As evening approached, DeShawn Carter found herself back in her office, the same space where months earlier she had made the decision to go undercover. Agent Randall Cooper sat across from her, his navy blue suit jacket hanging on the chair as they reviewed the final reports from the investigation. The ripple effects continue to spread, Cooper reported, his muscular frame relaxed for the first time in months. We're getting calls from attorneys in other jurisdictions reporting similar patterns of corruption. Your courage in that courtroom opened floodgates that had been sealed for decades. DeShawn Carter nodded, understanding that her experience had become a symbol of something larger. The chains that bound Eleanor Whitfield's courtroom weren't just legal or procedural, she reflected. They were psychological. People had been conditioned to accept the unacceptable because they believed the system was too powerful to challenge. And now? Cooper asked. Now they know that no one, regardless of their position or power, is above the law. The robe doesn't make the judge, and the badge doesn't grant unlimited authority. Justice belongs to the people, and when we stand together, we can reclaim it from those who would corrupt it. The office grew quiet, as both reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. Outside, the city continued its evening rhythm, but something fundamental had shifted. The corrupt system that had seemed so entrenched, so permanent, had been exposed and dismantled through the combined efforts of courageous individuals who refused to accept injustice as inevitable. DeShawn Carter thought about the young lawyers now entering the profession, inspired by what they had witnessed. She thought about the judges who would think twice before abusing their authority, knowing that someone might be watching, recording, investigating. She thought about the families who would never have to endure what so many had suffered under Whitfield's corrupt reign. Most importantly, she thought about the moment when she had risen from Whitfield's courtroom floor, brushed off her dignity, and revealed the truth. That moment had become more than personal vindication. It had become a symbol of resistance against systematic oppression. The chains that had bound so many for so long had finally been broken, not through violence or hatred, but through courage, persistence, and an unwavering belief that justice, while sometimes delayed, would ultimately prevail. Eleanor Whitfield's courtroom had been a symbol of corruption and racial hatred, but it had ultimately become the place where those very chains were shattered forever. As DeShawn Carter prepared to leave her office that evening, she knew that the work would continue. There would be other corrupt officials to expose, other systems to reform, other chains to break. But for now, she could take satisfaction in knowing that her willingness to endure humiliation had led to liberation for so many others. The fluorescent lights dimmed as she gathered her files, but the light of justice burned brighter than ever, illuminated by the courage of those who refused to let darkness prevail. You just witnessed resilience that refused to break. If this story deserves to be remembered, help us make sure it is. Subscribe, share, and let's keep these voices echoing for generations to come.